of that has been that the continent has remained resilient. However, there are some risks. Let's discuss this now with the Chief Economist of the African Development Bank, Professor Kevin Urama. Prof, good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, my sister.
Yeah, Prof, you guys had fun last week without me. That wasn't fair.
Yeah, we missed you.
So please share with us, what are some of those highlights of the economic outlook from the meeting?
Thank you very much. As you already said, this year we focused on the African Economic Outlook report, focusing on mobilizing Africa's development financing at scale in a fragmented world. Now, that point of a fragmented world is because we've seen a lot of multipolarization in global governance. We have seen trade fragmentation, supply chain disruptions, global and geopolitical crises, which is actually changing the way capital flows in the world. And the interesting finding of the report is that Africa's real GDP growth continues to do well, despite all the current Middle East crisis, but also the previous global shocks that we have faced during financial crisis, COVID, the oil price shocks, and all the other shocks that we've had. Africa has continued to do well. The real GDP growth rate in 2025 is estimated at 4.4%, and even after factoring in the impacts of the Middle East crisis, the continent will still maintain between 4.0 to 4.2%, depending on how long the crisis lasts. If it's 3 months, we will be at 4%. If it is more than 6 months, we'll be at 4%. And the growth was broad-based in the sense that 36 African countries improved, with 7 of them reaching very high levels of growth as well. I'll come to the figures you have there with regard to domestic revenue mobilization, which is the major point of what we have. Now, but one major finding on growth trends is that even though we're doing well on real GDP growth rates, our GDP per capita growth rates are not growing at par with our GDP growth rate. And for that reason, we don't have enough structural transformation, we don't have enough jobs for youths, and inequality remains very high on the continent, with a Gini coefficient of about 38.5%. And we find that the top 10% of Africa's population holds about almost 60% of Africa's wealth. So that creates poverty and insecurities and all these things that we see going around on the continent. And that's a major point that we need to focus on in terms of policy reforms. Now, but debt has also remained a problem, taking away resources from investments in productive capital accumulation on the continent. And one of the things we see there that was a bit surprising is that increasing borrowing on the continent for some countries actually reduces labor productivity and reduces total factor productivity, which means that the quality of debt is not that good. And we need to think about what we borrow, how we borrow, and what we use what we borrow for, so that the resources that are being borrowed in the name of citizens are able to yield dividends for the continent.
All right, Prof, we'd just like for you to jump to those slides that you saw earlier, about the tax and the revenue.
Okay, so when we come to the tax and revenue, the figures that you showed tells a good story. One, that the nominal rates of tax collection and revenue, domestic revenue mobilization on the continent is improving, but again, just like in the case of debt, tax productivity is not high enough, meaning that the tax to GDP ratio is going down even when the total nominal tax collection is going up. Reasons for this are diverse, one of which is the social contract between citizens and governments on the continent is very weak, and citizens don't believe that taxes are being used to deliver on public services. So by improving that social contract with citizens, we estimate that the continent can raise even more taxes without increasing the tax rate, because citizens will voluntarily be able to pay taxes, and we can be able to raise over $760 billion US just by adopting best practices without increasing tax rates. But again, we see that if you looked at non-tax revenue, which is the next slide that you have there, if you look at non-tax revenue, it's the same story. While tax revenue can give us an additional $469 billion US, non-tax revenue can give us more than $311 billion if only we are able to improve that social contract with citizens and allow citizens to be more confident that public services are being delivered and reduce implicit tax, meaning that people are not going to be providing their own electricity, building their own roads, and providing their own security while still paying taxes. So the figure you showed there is telling about the issue now with regard to the informal sector, which is very high on the continent. So if you look at this figure you have here, it's telling us that direct taxes are not doing so well on the continent because of the reason I have given. So, but indirect taxes, things like VAT, is mobilizing quite a lot for the continent and can still mobilize quite a lot on the continent. If you go to the next slide, it speaks to informality, the fact that we can mobilize an additional $125 billion US by just addressing informality on the continent. And if you look at this graph, country by country, you see how countries are doing with regard to the level of informality. And the rate of informality in the countries is also an indication of the confidence that citizens have about the formal sector in terms of how governments are using public resources to deliver public services. So, so generally, we see that the continent has a lot in terms of domestic resources that can be mobilized only if we improved macroeconomic policy governance, improved institutions and rule of law, and improved compliance by improving the social contract with citizens.
All right, so Prof, how do we sustain this resilience? Because one thing that jumps out of the reports when I went through it, at least the much I could, is resilience. We say that the continent is showing signs of resilience, even though there are threats, you know, and there are potentials to do even better. How do we sustain or even build more and have a better, resilient economy on the continent, especially amidst the geopolitical crisis?
Yes, that's the main purpose for this report, because we find that the sources of volatility in Africa's growth figures is because of external dependence. When we depend on external financing, which necessarily is depending on how the external financiers feel, then we're not in control of our own development. So that is why we focused on how to mobilize domestic capital, because if you are investing your own resources, you will be able to invest in a more systematic and continued way. First, let me also mention one of the drivers of resilience on the continent is just the sheer nature of the African economies, where we have a diversified economy, different structures of the economy, and so on. And commodity price rebounds. Whenever there's crisis, the prices, markets stabilize and prices come back. And because we sell mostly commodities, countries come back. But that is not because we're focusing on strengthening capital accumulation through broad-based structural policy reform. And the good thing is that in the past 5 years, we have seen a lot of structural reforms across countries, and this needs to be maintained. The third point that we need to do in order to sustain resilience is to build this social capital with citizens, the social contract with citizens, so that citizens are able in order to pay taxes. And that figure you are showing there is basically telling us that most citizens on the continent are willing to participate in governance by paying taxes if government simply simplify the tax policy, has an efficient tax administration, and delivers on public services, but also seeing prudent use of fiscal resources of countries so that they are not being asked to tighten their belt while maybe government officials are not tightening their belt, but then also strengthening accountability and transparency in our budgeting system, in our public finance management system, All of these things will build resilience in domestic revenue mobilization, allowing us to leverage more revenue to be able to do development with our own resources, not depending on ODA or FDI or all those external flows, which we see is declining, and with the fragmentation of the global economy may continue to decline. The other aspect of strengthening resilience is attracting the private sector. And by attracting the private sector, the simple thing we found in the report is that by improving, strengthening and creating predictability in the regulatory frameworks of countries, the macroeconomic policy environment, the business environment, the private sector will naturally come. Another aspect of that is providing a pipeline of bankable projects that they can invest in, because on the continent we have our institutional investors that hold about $4 trillion in assets under management, but only 2.7% of this is being invested because there are no bankable projects, and also because of risk perception due to the macroeconomic policy environment. Our high net worth individuals on the continent holds about $2.5 trillion. Again, we can leverage all these resources better in order to do development in our own terms, not depending on foreign capital coming on the continent. But then we have talked about the diaspora before. Last year, the diaspora released about $104.6 billion for consumption smoothing, that is called remittances. But if we create the structures, the systems, and the financial architecture that allows them to invest in productive investments, then this can rise to up to $1.1 trillion by 2050. So basically, the answer to your question is, it is in our hands. Let's improve the macroeconomic policy environment that can attract capital at scale, retain capital at scale, and effectively utilize capital in productive investments. Right. Then the second thing we need to do is to improve the social contract with citizens. And finally, before I stop, the president of the African Development Bank Group has already done the job for the continent in introducing the new financing architecture for development in Africa, NAFAD. And simply by implementing that NAFAD and also implementing the African Monetary Institute and the African Financing Stability Mechanism, which we have discussed before, the continent will be able to deal with its debt challenges. It will be able to deal with mobilizing and utilizing capital at scale. It will also be able to deal with investing properly and curating projects so that we can have those bankable projects that we have been speaking about. That's quite a lot in the report, which I will encourage viewers to read, because nitty-gritties on what each country needs to do. And I think we are at the cusp of taking hold of our own agency for development, which was the purpose of the report.
Yeah, Prof, thank you so much for that. But better than that, we do hope to see AFDB, as you said, the president has initiated some steps. But to see the AFDB working closely with governments on the continent to actually, build on these factors that the AFDB have noted or has noted, and then, to actually see it happen or affect the welfare of the people. So going beyond macro to micro now, because we've been seeing some good macro data, but we're waiting for the micro. But thank you so much, Prof, for your time on the program. And you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much. For me, the next thing to do is to implement.
Yeah, exactly.
We know what we need to do. We know the challenges are, what the challenges are, and we have the solutions. The institutions, the architecture is there. Let's just implement.
Exactly, Prof. Thank you so much. Chief Economist of AFDB, Professor Kevin Urama. Let's take a break now. When we come back, we'll be talking about CSR by OPay. They have some money for Scholars Program. We'll have the details in a bit. Stay with us.